Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. Welcome to the bathtub. Today we're going to do another briefish piece about a writer I've been reading for many years. I'm doing an interview. Normally, I try to be careful when I'm reviewing something. I try not to do that as part of the bathtub. But in the case of Boyle, I'm doing his new book, and in the course of doing the new book, I've been catching up with some recent books of his. He's written a lot of books. Boyle. And These are the two I thought we'd talk about briefly today because I just read these. I've been reading Boyle since the 80s. I read Descent of Man when it came out in paperback. That's his first short story collection. He's quite extraordinarily prolific writer, which, it's not like he's not like, Joyce Carol Oates or something. He publishes a book every year or two. And he tends to be one of the only writers who I'm kind of jealous of who managed to publish a book of short stories almost every 3 or 4 years. So I can't think of anybody besides Updike, and then of course the outrageously, overbearingly talented and kind of annoyingly productive Joyce Carol Oates, who writes many good short stories, but just this fountain of stuff pouring out. And Boyle is a much more careful writer than that, I think, in a way. And I just read the first book of short stories I've read of his in many years. One of the things as you get older, I thought I'd sort of kept up with the guy, but I haven't read him in 10 or 15 years. And there's like a dozen books out, and I haven't read any of them. So I read his last one, the Relive Box. If you like short stories, I really strongly recommend this book. T C Boyle, he's got this weird middle name, Corregison Boyle. He must drive the Library of Congress crazy because on the front page of his book, the title page, it says T. Corregison Boyle, and that's too big for the book, so they put T C Boyle. I'm sure it's all over the library. But these stories were published over a few years. They're fairly recent. He writes the type of stories I like, which is they're all about 20 pages. They're not these little tiny brief little things, and they're pretty substantial stories. These always starts with some character in a pretty dire situation. There's so many good stories in here. I'll just mention The Fugitive. He writes a lot about people from South America or Mexico living in California, and he's written about that in Tortilla Curtain. This is about a young guy who's trying to work in the States, and he develops a horrible, very difficult to cure form of tuberculosis, and he's wandering around, and he shouldn't be, and the doctors get a hold of him, and they're trying to prevent him from going to work or leaving his apartment, and he goes crazy. He runs away from them, and basically the premise of the story is him running from these doctors who want to prevent him from spreading this terrible disease that's getting worse because of all the reactions to antibiotics and so forth. That's the closing story. It sounds horrifying. It's kind of a funny story. Almost all of his stories are quite funny. He gets into the characters' heads. He's pretty sympathetic to whoever he does when he's dealing with this young kid, this sort of immigrant kid doing horrible jobs, or Warrior Jesus about a young guy who works in he basically sells steaks. He's a chef in a steak house, and he's working on a comic about Warrior Jesus. And he starts off, he gets a really nice sense of an idea of a character in a specific situation, a kind of difficult part of their life, and he takes us through usually a few days in the course of most of his stories, and he really, really winds it up. He takes very simple, basic human situations, and he makes them into really good stories. He almost always ends with a good bang. He knows how to end the stories. There's a couple of, I don't remember this from my previous reading of him, there's a couple kind of science fiction stories in here. The Relive Box, the premise is that you can, instead of getting hooked on computer games, you can look into this box and see parts of your life and relive those moments in your life. It's a very interesting idea about a man living with his daughter, and he's getting hooked on this period of his life that he wants to keep reliving in the box. There's another one sort of like that about a time in the future when people are buying genetically modified pets. Again, they're funny stories. One of my favorite stories in here, there's a horrifying story in here called The Designee, which is basically, the premise is what you read about all the time, which is some elderly man who basically gets hooked into by some telephone con artists who say, we're going to get you to sign some stuff and we're going to give you $1 million. And by the way, can you send us $50 to start the pay for the press or do some legal work? And they basically just sucked this guy dry. I shouldn't have told you that, but it's a great little story. It really winds you up. And again, the ending, he knows how to end these stories. One other one I like, I'll tell you the one I don't like. You don't miss your water till the well runs dry. Very funny story, again, about the water crisis in California over the past 4 or 5 years. We kind of got out of our drought this year, but about going through it. It's in Santa Barbara where the drought was quite intense, and about a guy who's in his house, and him and his wife are taking baths together, and they have no water, and they can't take care of their plants, and they look next door, and they've got this beautiful garden. It's going really well, and they start noticing the neighbors are stealing water here and there, and it's a very funny, very good story. There's a story here called The Argentine Ant, which is my grouch on this thing is there's basically a rewriting of the Argentine Ant, and which is the great Calvino story, and I don't know what I think. He writes it and he acknowledges that it's from Calvino, and I don't know why he did that. I have no idea. The Calvino story is still better and it's still funnier. So that's my gripe. I didn't understand why he did that, and it may be hard for me to understand that one. Okay, the Terranauts. So I also read one of his novels. I've always preferred the stories, but I've read his novels in the past. I enjoyed them. I really enjoyed the Terranauts, and it's based on, he's done a lot of books in the last few years about kind of institutional histories, and this is about the kind of, I don't know what they call it in the real world, but those those people who are supposed to live in those big bubbles in the Midwest. I didn't follow the story where it happened, but it's a kind of a perfect story for Boyle, which is a group of people trying to live for 2 years in this controlled environment without nothing coming in, nothing coming out. So they're basically testing to see if they can survive on other planets or after the end of the world or after the end of our climate catastrophes, because we've known they're coming for years and we did nothing about it. And this is about this group of people. I really enjoyed this. It was a good read, and the sense of the characters, there's kind of this. He's very good at the kind of. I think of it a bit like, he reminds me of Zola. The novel as a laboratory experiment. He's really good at getting a small circle of people and isolating them somewhere and seeing how they react. And there's a little bit of a personality in each one of them that kind of drives all of the characters and how they interact and how they deal with one another. And there's a sort of inevitability to the way these social units function. And the ones I've read in the past are often like this. He takes them and he isolates them, and then he lets the novel take course. One of the books I remember enjoying a lot from years ago was East is East, which is about one of those, I think it's Yaddo. It's one of these writers' colonies. And again, the same idea. It's a bunch of writers in a closed environment. And as I recall, a Japanese samurai is running around in the place. Now, the other thing I'll say, just before I close, when I first saw Boyle stuff, I thought of him as the kind of, we talked about Barth last week, or Pynchon we've talked about, as a sort of fabulous with kind of really over-the-top fantastic or fantasy ideas. He's not at all. He's a very, very much a social realist. He's very big into getting the way people behave, the way they deal with one another, and the way they function in society. And most of the characters, whether it's the guys wondering why the people next door are stealing water from other people when they shouldn't be, that sort of sense of social responsibility is often in his stories and his books. If you haven't read him, I would definitely go out and get this. If you like short stories, you'll have a really great time with this book. And if you want to try one of his novels, the early one I really liked was East is East, and I really enjoyed the Terranauts as a picture of this group dynamic cut off from the rest of the world, but in a situation from the 90s, which kind of reminds us of the shit storm we're in right now as far as what we've done to our planet. And that is always kind of beating in the background of this book. So you could try either one of those and have a really good time. And while we're at it, we're going to do some Calvino. Read The Argentine Ant, which is one of my all-time favorite stories. And he does an homage to it. So you can decide that one for yourself. But definitely read this wonderful story by Calvino. It's hilarious. Okay, bye.